So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Digital Futures for Good. Today's episode is where we are going to look at the links between digital exclusion and food poverty. And we're going to show some clips from my conversation with Emma Revie, the Chief Exec of the Trussell. If you could put yourself on mute unless you're talking, that would be great. And do introduce yourselves in the chat panel. That's fantastic. So Digital Futures for Good is a conversation series that we're recording for 2024. We're going to have 10 conversations with thought leaders across the year. And at the end of the year, we're going to have a report. So this is a broadcast with our expert panel. So welcome to Nicola Wallace-Dean, who's the co-founder at Starting Point, and to Rachel Evans, who's the Senior Sustainability Business Manager at Vodafone UK. So welcome to Nicola and Rachel, who are going to be my expert panel for the broadcast today. Nicola, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello, thanks, Helen. My name's Nicola, and amongst other things, I am, as Helen said, co-founder of Starting Point Community Learning Partnership. There's a mouthful. Based in Stockport, but operating across Greater Manchester. And the focus at Starting Point is around informal adult learning and primarily digital inclusion. So really proud to be part of the National Digital Inclusion Network. Some of the team at Starting Point are part of the Ambassador Programme as well. And personally, I am delighted to be a trustee of Good Things.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for coming along and being one of our expert panel today, Nicola. And Rachel, introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you. It always puts pressure on when you say expert multiple times, but it's very lovely to be here. I'm also relieved because the fire alarm was going off until about 10 seconds ago, so I thought I was going to have to make a bit of a quick exit. But yeah, so I'm Rachel. I work at Vodafone in our sustainable business team, and I look after our digital inclusion programs, of which a key part of that is our strategic partnership that we have with Good Things Foundation, and we also have a strategic and quite long-running partnership with Trussell Trust. So this is really brilliant for me to be here today, because kind of with both hats on in terms of the partnerships that we work on. And yeah, I mean, we've been working in this space for a number of years now, and it still shocks me with some of the stats that we're seeing, both in kind of the report that you've recently brought out of Good Things, but also the Trussell Trust last week in terms of the state of the nation from a reliance on food banks point of view. So I'm really excited to hear what Emma had to say and have a bit of a chat today.
Fantastic. Welcome, Rachel, and welcome to Nicola. As I said, Digital Futures for Good is a conversation series throughout 2024. We wanted to make sure that we talked to a range of different people who all have different interests and different overlap with digital exclusion. So to date, we've talked to politicians, we've talked to Martha Lane Fox, who, amongst many things, .com entrepreneur, alongside lots of other hats that she wears. And so we wanted to actually think about civil society, and so who in the charity sector is working with people who are going to be digitally excluded. And of course, we turned to Emma Revie. So we had a conversation with Emma, and what we're going to do today is show a few clips and have a bit of a conversation. There will be an opportunity where we can, I will ask the audience. So by all means, throughout the session today, put comments, put questions in the chat panel, and we'll pick those up towards the end of the session. So let's go to Emma Revie for our first clip about food poverty and digital exclusion. And is digital exclusion something that you've picked up as a need for the people coming into the food banks?
Absolutely. We know that access to the internet now is not a nice to have. We need it to look for work. We need it to do our homework, our coursework, to apply for things online, to get better deals on our energy. And if people are unable to afford food, they're also very likely to be unable to be digitally connected. In fact, 1 in 6 people we see in our food banks have no access to the internet at all, and less than half have access via their mobile phone, and even fewer have access to the internet in their home. So it's a real problem. And so we've been really grateful for our partnership with Vodafone and also with Tesco Mobile, where we're able to provide access to free SIM cards. So as people can have digital access, because it's so critical, not just to enabling people to access income, but also to reduce their costs. I think you'll know this far better than I, but particularly for social security, 70% of people we see in our food banks are receiving universal credit, which is our social security system. And yet 9 out of 10 people on universal credit we know are unable to afford the essentials, including access to the internet. And yet being able to access universal credit is a digital by default system. To be able to find out if you're eligible for it, to apply for it, to update the system, requires you to be able to have access to the internet. So there's a real issue, a wider issue around the sufficiency of social security, but even being able to access it is a significant problem.
Will you just unmute, Helen?
That's great. So thanks, Tash. So a taster there from Emma Revie. So she says that internet access is not a nice to have, and she says 1 in 6 people coming to food banks are also digitally excluded, and less than half are using the internet on their mobile phone. So Nicola, going to you first, does that shock you that there's such a huge overlap by people using food banks and people who are digitally excluded?
I think, when we talk about social security, we're talking about standards of living, aren't we, really? And I think a couple of the points that just jump out at me there is especially where she talks about limited access, that potentially people have got access on a phone. So anybody looking at this from the outside that don't live in the world that we live in think, oh, well, that's good enough. But actually, really, is it? That on the introduction, I said I wear many hats. And one hat that I didn't mention is that I'm also a mum. And I have a 14-year-old that quite freely uses a mobile phone. And that conversation about what is and what isn't an acceptable standard of digital and what people can and can't afford is really important. That I think it's about, especially for young people, about social development and them being able to keep up with everybody else, as well as just educational attainment. And I think that the word that probably sprung to mind the most is around dignity and what we can expect as somebody that lives in this country, that we can ensure that we have an adequate standard of living that not only affords us food, but also affords us access to absolutely everything that's online right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rachel, you obviously work with Good Things Foundation and with Trussell Trust. So what's the sweet spot for you working with both of these charities?
I think when I go back to where we started our partnership with Trussell Trust, and it was actually during COVID, and it was at a time when we were completely locked down, but food banks were still operating. They were seen as an essential service, and actually kind of the reliance on them became even more during COVID, which kind of brought to light the issue for us. And it was a place of wanting to do something, us wanting to help, but actually how do we access the people who are in that moment of crisis? And to Nicola's point, I completely agree that not surprised that if you're someone who's using a food bank that you're going to be without connectivity, because yes, we talk about connectivity being an essential, but when it comes down to that choice of, am I going to feed myself or my child today, or am I going to pay for broadband, we know that food is going to be that choice. I think what we're all here in agreement of is that that's just a choice that you shouldn't ever have to make. But so it's been a really sweet spot for us in terms of being able to access the people who are in that moment of crisis, who need that support. And I mean, Emma talked about not being able to access things like universal credit if you're not online, but also for us, it's things like going to a food bank, often sometimes for the first time, which we've learned from Trussell Trust, is a really of nerve-wracking experience. It's also it's a very humbling experience. And if you then also don't have connectivity, you're probably quite isolated and cut off from people who are important to you. And then you're going through a very challenging, difficult experience. And kind of to your point, Nicola, where's the humanity in that, in terms of people being able to connect with others and have that kind of keep that social side of it up, and their support systems around them? So I think for us as well, that's just been such an important part of it. And then being able to work with you at Good Things as well to look at, okay, food banks are one place where people are going to in that moment of crisis, but where are the other places people are going to in their communities, rather than trying to get people to go.
We just lost you. We've just lost your audio.
Somewhere different, kind of finding where they're already at. Am I back?
Yes.
I did just get a flash up that said unstable network connection, which is always encouraging when I'm in the head office of Vodafone.
Well, I think we got the gist of it. Thanks, Rachel. Let's go to the next clip, where Emma is kind of bringing up that point again about universal credit almost being digital by default and some of the problems that creates.
I think that point about people being able to afford things that we agree between us are essential is so important. So we agree that access to the internet is essential in order to be able to function in our current modern society. We also, everyone, the general public, agree that everyone should be able to afford food. We should have a safe and secure place to live. If we are unable to work, or we're unable to work more hours, if we have caring responsibilities, we should be able to afford the essentials, which is why we put in place our social security system. And yet, at the moment, what we know from our data is that social security is not covering the costs of those essentials. Over the last 5 years, and in 2022, there were 3.2 million people who experienced destitution, the very deepest form of poverty. That's 2.5 times more than the number of people experiencing it in 2017. That's a huge increase in the depth and severity of poverty that people are living with. And that means that people simply aren't able to afford the essentials. Digital inclusion being one of them, food being a very important other one. This is something we need to take serious action on. It's not right that anyone should have to rely on an emergency food parcel to feed themselves and their families. But also, it's not fit for purpose. A food parcel doesn't help you buy your kids' school shoes, doesn't put money on the meter if you need electricity. It's insufficient. So we don't think it's right that anyone should have to come to a food bank. And we know that it doesn't have to be that way. We know what is causing people to have to come to the food bank, and we know what actions we can take to end the need for them. So we would love to see a future. We believe we can see a future where no one needs a food bank to get by. And there are some key stepping stones to that. The first and most important one is around ensuring the sufficiency of social security. That conversation we just had about the essential items, making sure that there's a guarantee for people's essentials, that the level at which we pay universal credit is set at a level that is enough to afford the essentials that we all need to live. And at the moment, there's a huge gap there. We know, we've calculated that for a single person, they need £120 a week to cover the cost of essentials. At the moment, universal credit is set at £92. But that's before deductions, and often people are sanctioned or deductions are taken off to pay historic debts or through admin errors, and a lot of people are left with actually just £70 a week to get by. And it's that gap that means people are having to choose between essentials, go without access to the internet in order to pay food and essential bills. And that again perpetuates a vicious cycle. We've heard from people we've spoken to that they've been sanctioned because they didn't prioritise having internet access, so couldn't update their universal credit journal because they prioritised food and paying essential bills. So we need to do something about putting in place in legislation an essentials guarantee that says going forward, the level at which we pay social security will be enough to cover those essentials.
It's quite shocking, the idea that someone's on universal credit and it doesn't cover their essentials, and then they choose to not have internet access, and then they can't do their universal credit logbook, so then they get sanctioned, so then they have less money. I mean, I can't believe we live in that country. Nicola, obviously one of the things that we do with our strategic partners, including Vodafone and Virgin Media O2, is the National Data Bank. So we call the National Data Bank like a food bank for data. The one thing that I think is fantastic about this country is that we have this safety net. So we have food banks, and we have hubs and places where people can go in the local area, and we have local data banks where people can get free connectivity. How often do you feel that that is sufficient to help those people to not fall through that net and to get what they need at that community level? I mean, the community works so incredibly hard to provide that safety net.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that conversation about food banks and data banks, it's where the problems show up, isn't it? You know, that was what it's about, and 9 times out of 10 that's at a real hyperlocal community level. I think, you know, there was a tagline in the video that said everybody connected. I'm guessing that's a Vodafone one, and actually it resonates because it's everybody connected where they want to be connected. Because I think we hear too many times about, you know, that pushback on, we see people that have a contract, and then within 2 weeks of their contract they've used all their data, and then they're being sanctioned. We've heard that story time and time again, and some of the pushbacks we get, why don't they go to the library? It's free in the library. And actually, again, you know, without wanting to sound like a broken record, it's about the dignity thing, isn't it? You know, ridiculously at 6 o'clock this morning I did my online shop because that was at a time and in a place that suited me, and actually being able to have mobile data. I mean, I would go as far as to say it's not enough, but it's good for now. But being able to have mobile data to be able to function online in a way that suits you and is right for you is absolutely crucial. And just to the point where I said that potentially it's not enough, that echoes that point of, you know, are we in a place that we say, yeah, I remember when there was a big increase in food banks maybe about 15 years ago, and somebody came to us once and said, how do I say to someone, and the world has changed significantly, caveat on this, how do I say to the person that gives me some tinned peaches that are in syrup that I'm diabetic and I don't want those? And I'm like, you just say that, you know. But I think we're probably in that position with digital inclusion now, where somebody's saying, how do I say that actually I've run out of data because my kids are watching Netflix because they want to talk the same conversations as other kids in school are talking, because that's really important. And I think it's really kind of understanding why digital is important. And we talk about you know, filling in your universal credit book and being sanctioned and using the NHS app and these really vital things, but actually shifting that conversation to the good to have as well, I think it's really important. And the best thing about the current process is that, for me, the paperwork isn't laborious. We're not asking people to prove that they need the data bank. I think if you've had to show up and you've had to walk through the doors of a food bank or the doors of a local centre that offers data bank, that should be enough. You know, that to then have to jump through hoops, it doesn't feel right, and it's not right. And I think the fact that we don't have to do that and we can rely on really trusted partners within the network is really vital to the whole process.
Absolutely. And Nicola, just coming back, Rachel said earlier about the Vodafone, they started working with Trussell Trust during the pandemic. And in fact, I think, Rachel, you started working with us during the pandemic as well. And I think that, you know, a really big thing, and, you know, Nicola, you are a real, you know, advocate or instigator, let's say, of in that first March 2020, when all of the local community partners, all the digital inclusion hubs, the libraries, all their doors were closed, and the scale of the issue of people not having access, not having devices, not having connectivity, not being able to afford either, really kind of hit home. And I know that probably, Nicola, you knew that that was there. Whereas I think I kind of thought, well, someone else has sorted that out. I don't mean it's somebody else's problem, is that we at Good Things and with the network was very much about skills, but then very quickly we started being about devices and data as well. And that now I actually have made a huge shift psychologically. I believe that everyone should be entitled to having their own personal device and sufficient connectivity to be able to do what it is that they need. And I absolutely agree with you about that kind of transaction thing. But the pandemic really shifted my mind. But you're there in the community. So did it have such a big effect on you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think, I mean, you said that you probably knew. I don't think we did, not to that extent. You know, I don't think anybody really understood what lockdown would feel and would be. And you know, the story's been said many times, but a real true one, that within those first weeks, we had a chap that put a piece of paper in his window saying, "Can somebody phone me?" Because he had COPD and he had no credit on his phone. And literally, you know, we were in 2020 and that was his way of communicating with the outside world. And I just think where we were then, and we knew that we knew that the affordability was always an issue. And we had some very small fixes, but nothing that was sustainable and that could reach where we are now. And actually, I would say the whole offer is reversed, that we can now hook people in by supporting them with that basic level of needing data. Then hopefully with a device as well. And at that point, we then tackle skills and confidence. Whereas prior to the pandemic, it was completely reverse process of we can do skills and confidence and we'll try and do the rest. But actually what we'll do is signpost you to other places like libraries, for example. But yeah, when you have all that safety net removed, you have to do things differently, don't you? And I think that you know, if there are some positives that came out of that time, the fact that we've got this support network's massive.
Yeah, definitely. And there's some great points in the chat panel about the dignity of having your own device, you know, the being able to do it at 6 a.m. in the morning if you want to, but also equally that places like community centres and libraries aren't even, you know, they're also short of money and don't necessarily have the right number of volunteers and the right number of devices. I mean, clearly we still have a big mountain to climb. So, Rachel, whose job do you think it is to fix the digital divide?
I mean, the short answer is it's everyone's. But I think kind of reflecting on what both you and Nicola were talking about just there, and how we see food banks and data banks as the safety net. I absolutely think that's what they should be, and that there's a role for us in business to play in that, and in the third sector and communities. But I think my worry is that at the moment, they're not a safety net. There's more of a reliance on them and an expectation on them. And that whereas we see the data bank and the food bank as giving you, in that moment of crisis, just a bit of breathing space to help you then get back on your feet, 6 months later, we've got people coming back to the food bank because they still can't afford the connectivity. They're still in the same position. And that actually that's where we need to see more action being taken from government alongside what we're doing across industry and across sectors to help tackle this issue, which is why we've always been a supporter of the Guarantee Our Essentials campaign that Trussell Trust are running, because being able to ensure that people have got the absolute basic income to be able to afford those essentials is what's going to actually help to fix this for good, rather than it constantly being a sticking plaster that people come back and rely on these food banks and on these data banks. And to your point, Nicola, around building that digital skills and confidence piece, that's where we want to get to the point where that's what these community hubs are doing, is that's what they get to focus on, is that there's an expectation that everyone has the connectivity they need in a way they want it, and now how can we make sure that you're getting the most out of it and that it's working for you? And I think that's kind of the next step, but we've still got a long way to go on fixing that fundamental piece.
Absolutely. And Joe points out in the chat panel that actually the SIMs that people get through the data bank, it's also the phone number, that sometimes people don't even have a phone number, because even if you need an email address to sign up for something like a housing application, you often also need a phone number, and if you don't have that, you are also stuck. So we've got 2 more clips from Emma Revie, so let's see what Emma Revie says about what the future might look like.
And obviously technology is only a tool for people to do what people want to do with it, to create the society for the people for whom we want that society to work for. I mean, I think that politicians are potentially sleepwalking into a future where we are going to have, as you said, that there will be new jobs created, but will they be for the people who are displaced, and will they be in the places where those people will be living? It's just such an important question. So think about the politicians then, you know, we're expecting a general election at some point, maybe this year. Do you have recommendations, asks, manifestos? So what do you want from the government, the next government?
So I've covered some of them, but the main ask would be a commitment to a future without the need for food banks. Yeah. We need a vision for that. We need a plan to be put in place to make that happen. I've talked through some of those building blocks. The first ask would be to put in place an essentials guarantee that guarantees the level of social security will cover the costs of essentials. But then those other areas that I covered around access to advice, access to safe and secure housing, support for disabled people to ensure that they get decisions on their benefits in a timely manner that's person-centric. These are all things that would help us reach a future where nobody needs a food bank, because none of us will allow it. How about you? You must also have manifesto asks for the government.
That we want to fix the digital divide. So we want to have a future where there isn't a digital divide, so lots of commonality there. We see that there's a co-investment between government and business, so I think that it's very much about making sure that all sectors are working to do this, to create the society that we want. And absolutely believe that co-investment to help us through the next decade is around making sure that we do have this national network for all, the building on the National Digital Inclusion Network, so people have somewhere to go locally to be able to get the skills and support that they need and the access that they need. We also have some very practical asks, because we believe that everyone should have access to the internet, so it should be affordable. I really want the government, the current or the next one or whatever, to role model the reuse of their technology for digital inclusion. It feels to me just such a obvious route. So we already have the National Device Bank, so we want them to be able to donate all of their devices, which we'll be able to securely clean and put them into the hands of people. We have 5 times as many people wanting and needing devices. Some of the digital inclusion hubs are saying they have waiting lists of 70 to 100 people who just don't have device and don't have that access. So it's a really critical area, but we think the government can role model that, and we believe that there should be affordable access. So that's obviously supporting the National Data Bank. It could be removing VAT on social tariffs. You know, the idea that the poorest people in society who can afford a broadband connection still pay 20% tax doesn't seem to be ethical. Or it could be about, back to your point about sufficiency, is it that we work out who can't afford it and then make sure that they have it. So that could be, for example, with social housing providers, but just that affordability, a universality that let's get to a place where we know everybody has access, however much money they've got at any point.
So, and Caroline Milton from Trussell has put a link to the Essentials Guarantee campaign in the chat panel. Do you think, so Rachel, let's come to you. Do you think we could expect to have an essentials guarantee from a government of any political persuasion within the next few years?
I mean, I'm hopeful that we could, and I think what makes it harder for them to kind of ignore the case is the way that both Trussell Trust and Joseph Rowntree Foundation together are putting this case forward, the data kind of that they're able to provide, and Emma's kind of alluded to some of those numbers there in terms of what actually is an amount that is needed, what are those essential goods, that basket of essentials, how much that costs versus what people are getting access to. And I think it's such a simple thing to see the difference in that you really would hope that it's something that is hard to turn down. I think it's also, as we're kind of discovering through this conversation, how much of a barrier being digitally excluded is to then getting out of other issues that you're facing or other levels of poverty. And if we can kind of talk about or get the digital divide to be recognised as important a social issue to government as others are, so that we can kind of show that by tackling this, it's the gateway to people being able to look at how do they get back into housing, being able to access healthcare, being able to access other services that are available to them. I think we just got to keep banging the drum and making the case.
Absolutely. I think there's a case there as well about, we sometimes talk about health and well-being, Nicola, you said it already. I think that quite often we talk about that transaction about making a GP appointment, ordering a repeat prescription. But actually, if you think about what you were saying earlier about children being able to talk to their friends about what's happening, so the internet isn't just a transactional. In some ways, it's quite different to food in that way. It's not just something that you need to stay alive as with food, but actually it's that the internet is part of that social fabric, isn't it, as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's that age old, it's about thriving, not just surviving, isn't it? And actually, I just thinking about your question there earlier about can we see a space where we have a social security system that for both working people and those out of work that allow us a dignified standard of living. And I think actually it's about longevity, and I am deeply wedded within the community and voluntary sector and see all the very short-term micro initiatives and funding that come to place to, as we've said before, they are simply plasters over a bigger issue, and we're not really exploring the root causes. And you just think, you've got organizations that are providing holiday and food clubs in summer holidays, organizations that actually are doing brilliant stuff on very limited budgets that don't know whether that provision will be there at Christmas because central government aren't forward planning. And you think all these small initiatives that make a small dent in this issue, if we actually pulled all of that and were really brave about it and thought long term rather than government terms, potentially we could then get to that place, and you say about the transaction stuff, and actually what's made me think throughout all of the videos is, what does it actually feel like for, that we get young people that come with their parents when their parents are asking for data, and you have little ones in pushchairs turning up to food banks, and what's the long-term impact on that? That we had one thing that really stands out that happened about 12 months ago. So I was having a conversation with he was probably only about 10, and he told me quite proudly that he lives in a food desert. Now, how on earth does he know what that term is? And sadly, he's growing up in a place where he knows the value of his postcode for the community and voluntary sector because he's in a priority area. And actually, I feel like I'm just using the word dignity all the time, but what does that do for that young person's self-esteem and respect? And his ability to thrive in the future and his ambition. And I think actually we talk about poverty, but I just wonder if some of this is actually a poverty of hope, that actually by being in a position where you're constantly having to ask for the goodwill of others, what does that erode long term?
Yeah, and when we think about the health system, so Wes Streeting, for example, talks about prevention being as important as cure. I mean, whether or not there'll be enough money to focus on prevention and cure, but that's what you're talking about from a kind of societal point of view, right, Nicola? Is that like we have to understand how do we make sure that we do not have food deficit in the first place, but then make sure that our children see that the world is a world of opportunity and a world of hope and a world that has them as part of it. One of the things that Emma Revie says, because I asked her about AI. So, for example, quite often we talk about the risks from AI as being about algorithm bias or safety, fake news, but actually rather than actually exploring what sort of society will we have, so actually if we have mass automation and the people who run those businesses are going to benefit and shareholders are going to benefit, then that will actually displace people from jobs. So it's the kind of society that we want. And actually, hopefully people in the audience have watched Martha Lane Fox. Martha Lane Fox, when we interviewed her for Digital Futures for Good, talked about we want to make sure that we can imagine a modern society. So this is not about technology. This is about what kind of society do we want and how does technology enable us to get there. And although I would say that Martha and Emma Revie are talking in quite different ways and using different types of language, and they obviously come from very different backgrounds, I think they're both saying very similar things. And that in the longer video that you'll be able to see with Emma Revie, that she talks about choice. She says we have choices, we are human beings, we are leaders, we make choices every day about what kind of society we want, and then we bear the consequences of people making the wrong choices. Or in fact, let's just put it back on ourselves. If we make the wrong choice, then we don't get the society that we want. So let's go to our last clip. So I ask everybody at the end of Digital Futures for Good about what would they do in their first 100 days as Prime Minister to fix the digital divide. So let's hear what Emma had to say.
Well, I think you definitely should be made the Prime Minister. So my final question is, imagine you were made that Prime Minister, what would you do in the first 100 days? And I'm going to be cheeky here. I'm going to make you fix the digital divide, right? So in your first 100 days, what would you be doing to help to fix the digital divide?
Well, I wouldn't have thought it will surprise you to say the first thing my government would be doing would be putting in place an essentials guarantee. And because digital connectivity, internet access is one of those essentials, by setting in legislation that there's a level at which universal credit will be set that covers those essentials, we'd be ensuring that people were able to access the internet. I think then when we look beyond that, after the first few days, I'll be looking to tackle those wider issues around people having a secure place to live. And I think with also being able to afford internet access, you'd be able to have a secure place to live with digital connectivity in your home. But also about ensuring people can access the right advice and support, which you talked about so well there, about supporting people to get an understanding of what they're eligible for, what they're entitled to just walk with people through some of the complexities of accessing support is really important. So I think that combination of sufficiency, of people being able to afford the essentials, that wraparound support, and ensuring people have secure, safe homes in which to live and flourish. So they would be the priorities for the first 100 days. How about you?
Gosh. Well, as Prime Minister, I would first of all say that fixing the digital divide was something that I would put my leadership behind, make happen. As we said already, is that the incentive and the benefits to society for doing that, because just the sheer cost of leaving people behind, actually that these safety nets have to keep being put in place to support them. So leadership, priority, I would say that within 100 days, I would have an action plan to fix the digital divide. And then I would convene businesses, lots of people from cross departments, lots of civil services, I'm sure, would have really great ideas about how it could help their policy areas, and obviously civil society to help to co-create that plan and then to co-invest in that plan. And two of those solutions, one would be building on the National Digital Inclusion Network to make sure every community where people needed it, that they could have that local support. And incredibly pragmatically, I would just absolutely get all that old tech out of the cupboards in all those government departments and put them in the hands of digitally excluded people.
Little bit of leadership, a little bit of pragmatism. That's Helen on the way. So I think that actually throughout the series we've had lots of great potential prime ministers coming forward. So just listening to Emma there, Rachel, what do you think that which of those, well, Emma or me, whatever you like, which of the policies and actions do you think are most likely, or maybe just the ones you most hope would happen?
I think, I mean, I've talked about our support for the Essentials Guarantee and how I think that that's a brilliant thing. So I think that aside, the way that Emma talks about the kind of walking side by side with people, making sure that they're informed, and that advice piece, I think that's something that's really critical here. And again, I know Nicola's been talking about it and we've all been talking about it a lot in terms of the dignity part of this. It's so that people are feeling empowered in what they're doing, and that things are being done with them and not to them. So how can we make sure that all of that advice is available in an understandable way and where people need it, so that they can get the most out of the things that are available to them? And I think another key part of that, which is what you were kind of talking about, Helen, is how we're leaning on civil society, the organisations who are the experts in this, who can help advise on what it is that needs to be done. So I think what's a brilliant crossover between yourselves and Trussell Trust here is you've got two different parts of it. You've got Trussell Trust talking about the Guarantee Our Essentials campaign and how much people need. And then on the good things side, you've got the piece of work that you've done that shows the economical benefit of when people are on the right side of the digital divide. So how can we kind of bring those two things together to kind of help make the case for why these things are important?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Nicola, what about yourself? What were the policies and actions that you either most liked or most likely, or which would you like to see come to fruition?
Yeah, I think that point that, you know, every device that's paid for by the public purse needs to come back to those that need it the most. So not just the equipment that's currently stored in cupboards, who knows where, but also everything that's coming upstream, that, you know, that is a continual support, isn't it? That seems, I don't know, I'm not techie, but it seems quite a straightforward thing to do. I also think, I mean, I could do a whole thing on what I think about VAT, but I think that an absolute to acknowledge that being online, you know, it is a utility, and actually we should be paying VAT at the same rates as water and things like that. I think is a massive support. And then I think, you know, as somebody from the community and voluntary sector, I think an overhaul of adult education budgets would be welcomed, to potentially look at investing on impact rather than just on enrollments. That, you know, that sometimes we're supporting the people furthest away from being able to, you know, on some occasions make the right choices, but what we think potentially are the right choices, and that takes time and effort, and that needs to be supported. And I think that for me, my real worry is that I think a lot of this, and we've not mentioned, is women are being disproportionately affected by that. You know, returning to work, the idea of automation taking over retail and hospitality, and I think I would actually convene a task force on how women are directly impacted in all of this. Yeah,
and there's some really great articles online about how the the jobs that are going to be displaced by AI are disproportionately currently being held by women as well. So actually the potential unemployment wave that's going to be coming is likely, if it comes, to disproportionately affect women. There's a question in the chat panel from Iris, who asked about your thoughts on the campaign for Essentials Guarantee in light of the recent push by the Prime Minister and DWP to reform welfare and tackling the supposed issue of benefits fraud, also involving automated detection. Do either of you have a comment on that? Caroline Milton very helpfully has replied to Iris as well. Nicola or Rachel, about the my reading between the lines is that is back to that, I guess, almost like that sanctions question, that it's, you know, what the numbers, so a single person gets £120 a week, and that, no, £92 a week, and the essentials basket is £120, so they're already out of pocket. But then if you put on that historical debts, potential sanctions, then it's more like £70. So that gap gets wider and wider, and I'm sure that's what Iris is saying as well. Joe Holland is making a comment about the extent of the digital divide and deprivation is extremely important in ensuring that the UK has a digital minimum standard. I think he's also mentioned the minimum digital living standard that Liverpool University has done, and that we've supported, working with the National Digital Inclusion Network, so that everyone has the skills and access to digital facilities at home. And I think some of the conversations that you've heard and the wider conversation with Emma Revie about that kind of idea of sufficiency or universality, when you talk about, you know, both food, money, and about internet access. So a question here from Tahira is, how can public Wi-Fi support digital exclusion? So Rachel, I'm sure you are the provider of some public Wi-Fi. Do you think it has a role in supporting digital exclusion?
I think it absolutely does. I think, but in terms of, I mean, fundamentally what we do is we are a network provider. And I think ensuring that we have a strong, reliable network that is where people need it across the country is an absolute priority. I think, again, from our point of view, that requires investment in the network, which we are continually looking to do. And so it's how we measure that up against the other initiatives and support that we're putting in place, whether that's lower cost products like social tariffs that we've talked about, or the free connectivity that we have through the data bank and food banks. It's another piece of the puzzle. Yes, absolutely continuing to roll out and improve our network. I think to Nicola's point around people having connectivity where they need it. So not just assuming that because it's available in a public place that is going to solve the problem, but it's absolutely an element and a part of the puzzle.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that I mean, my view around public Wi-Fi is that I know during the early days of the first lockdown, we knew that children were sitting outside McDonald's to use their free Wi-Fi or sitting in the city centre in the rain with an umbrella because they did, you know, to get the free Wi-Fi. So I think it's back to that point. It's part of a puzzle, but it doesn't actually bring all those things around dignity that we were talking about earlier. I don't know, Nicola, if you wanted to comment on that, but there's some other comments in the chat panel. By all means, have a comment if you want to, Nicola.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, it's part of the puzzle. My concern around that would be around safety and around sharing, especially in public spaces, that, you know, data tells us that there's sometimes an assumed level of knowledge around internet safety. We tend to see people coming through our doors who are, you know, absolutely paralyzed through fear of being online, but also there's that other side where people don't know what they don't know, and as a result, you know, could be putting themselves in quite compromising positions. And I think that alongside that, you know, that public Wi-Fi absolutely supports our hopes for everybody to be online, but there's a skills piece in that as well.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things, so in July we're going to have an episode around health, and a conversation with two people who have worked one's in NHS England, and one is someone who's worked a lot in health and in health and technology. And actually talking to various people through the Digital Futures for Good series has made me realise how many safety nets there are. Right, so we talk about food banks and digital inclusion hubs, data banks today. That in the health conversation, we talk about family hubs, which is, I'm hoping, is a reincarnation of Sure Star centres. But also we're talking to banking hubs. So that there's now banking hubs in mostly in market towns where all the banks have disappeared. So there's lots of places where physical places where people can go to do specific things. And actually that one thing that would be good to move forward with would be to try and, I mean, literally sew up all the safety nets. So actually, I remember, I mean, I guess it's probably 2 decades ago, we used to talk about like no wrong door, right? That actually wherever you go, you get the help that you need. And I know, Nicola, that places like Starting Point, we very much have that philosophy that if you can't help someone, you're going to find somewhere locally for them to get that help. But actually, finding a better way that we're not having to do all of that in a piecemeal way, a bit like you were saying earlier. I'm going to come to you both in a minute and ask you about your first 100 days, but I just want to pick up. So Ian and Danielle have both talked about tech and the big tech players brought into the conversation, and Ian's concern about refurbished devices and upgrades and repairs. So, I think both really, really good comments and reflections. Kate here, and Nicola, I'm going to come to you, because Kate is saying that actually even access to volunteering, so for people who use food banks, quite often want to give back. And I think the same is often true for digital inclusion as well. When people get that support, it really changes their life. And then they want to give back, but actually more and more volunteering opportunities are exclusively going on online. So actually, or to find them going online. And so I know you do a lot of support for volunteers at Starting Point, Nicholas. I wondered if you wanted to comment on there.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting point about volunteering going online. Actually, it comes at a great day, actually, that most of our team are a bit bleary-eyed, that Stockport, where we operate, had an award ceremony last night for volunteers, and possibly at one point our longest standing digital champion won an award. Sadly, she passed away last year, so she didn't appreciate the award that she won yesterday, but actually the journey she traveled from being a learner with low levels of literacy, this is her story, she shared this many times, with low levels of literacy and very terrified of the internet, going through Learn My Way probably about 100 times, Helen, loving the fact that she got a certificate for the first time in her life, and realizing how good that made her feel, but then wanting to give back, and actually knowing her unique talent was the fact that she knew how people who worked through the door felt, because she'd walked through that door too. So absolutely, that role for volunteering is vital, and I think it's interesting in the digital inclusion space that it's not always the techie people that we need, it's the people that understand people. We are, I've kind of made a career out of only ever being one page ahead, so that's kind of what we say with volunteering as well. But I think from your point when you were saying there were loads of networks, they were physical networks, weren't they? And I think we can't get away from the fact, in order to fix the digital divide, those networks, people are still asking for physical networks. We're social beings, we want to get out there. We didn't enjoy lockdown. So the fact that things are going online, people are still asking for support in both avenues, aren't they? Both physically and online as well. And I think that's really important to remember.
Absolutely. in the conversation, Emma Revie said, I think it's something like 25% of people who go to Trussell Trust food banks haven't spoken to anybody for the last month. So, you know, that physical place is so important for so many reasons, as well as those food parcels. So we're just running out of time. Just very quickly, short, sharp, shock. What would you like to do in your first 100 days, Rachel, to fix the digital divide?
Oh gosh, well, I think it's absolutely making it a priority for my cabinet, in that they're embedding digital into all of their decisions. But I also think, how I've mentioned and you've said, is really convening civil society and listening to the experts who have got a lot of the insights and a lot of the brilliant solutions ready to go, and really making sure that their voices are brought into creating a plan.
Fantastic. And Nicola, your short, sharp 100.
I would echo that. All sectors working together on this, it's vital. It underpins absolutely every other form of support network. VAT down to 5%, all devices purchased from the public purse back into refurbished and recycling, and really supporting those community-based organisations who do a significant amount of this work in a sustainable way.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. Round of applause, virtual round of applause for Rachel and for Nicola. Thank you so much for helping us today. The recording of this program, the whole conversation that I had with Emma Revie is now available on YouTube, and maybe someone might put that in the chat panel, or we'll definitely send you out an email afterwards. So coming hot on the tail of the food banks and food poverty, destitution and digital exclusion, we're then going to have another devolution. So Andy Burnham is next. So we have our next episode with Andy Burnham on the 11th of June. A link to the Eventbrite is in the chat panel. So please do come along on the 11th of June to hear Andy Burnham, and of course the wonderful expert panel that we will have with us on that day. And a huge thank you to Emma Revie for supporting us and coming along to have such a wonderful conversation, and really illustrating that we are all providing such essential services for people experiencing poverty in all kinds of ways in today's society, but that it doesn't have to be like that. And I think that that we all have a lot of hope here today, a lot of hope about the future, but also that we have so many committed and wonderful people working on fixing the digital divide. So thank you all. Thanks again, Nicola and Rachel, for being here. Thanks to Emma Revie, and thank you all for coming. Thanks. Bye-bye.